Good afternoon, Brown alumni, parents and friends from around the world. My name is Josh Taub, Brown class of 1993, and I am the Assistant Vice President for International Advancement at Brown University. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today. I hope that everyone is doing well and most importantly, feeling healthy. Thank you so much for joining us from around the world for a new iteration of our International Advancement webcast series. This one with Professor Mark Blyth, Director of the William R. Rhodes Center for International Economics and Finance. We started these webinars back in the spring when COVID began to address global issues, specifically with Brown's international community in mind. So thank you all for taking a moment out of your busy day to continue engaging with Brown and to participate in the continued virtual life of the university. We are grateful to be able to continue bringing everyone together in these challenging times in support of our university and of course our students who, by the way, have returned to campus. They just came back last week for a mix of both in-person and remote classes and student life. So with that, it is my pleasure to tell you a bit more about our speaker, Professor Mark Blyth, Professor of Political Science and Director of the William Rhodes Center for International Economics and Finance. Professor Blyth grew up in Dundee in Scotland. He received a BA in Political Science from the University of Strathclyde in 1990, and then went on to receive an MA, MPhil, and PhD in Political Science in 1999 from Columbia University. After spending 12 years at Johns Hopkins as a professor of political science, he actually saw the light and came to Brown in 2009, where he has a joint appointment at Brown University's Watson Institute for International Studies and Public Affairs and the Department of Political Science. Back 4 years ago in 2016, Professor Blyth was one of the few people who predicted both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. He coined the term global Trumpism, a worldwide working class backlash against harmful macroeconomic trends. When he and I spoke just a month ago, he suggested the title for today's talk, Europe in a New Era of Geopolitics, How a Second Trump Term Might Strengthen the European Union. Well, as is so often the case these days, the past few weeks, the past month seems like a year ago. So let's see how his thinking has evolved over the past few weeks. If you have any questions during or after his remarks, please just post them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And following Professor Blyth's remarks, I will do my best to select questions and ask them on your behalf. So once again, welcome to our international alumni, parents and friends. And without further ado, please join me virtually in welcoming Professor Mark Blyth.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for, as old people would probably say, thanks for tuning in, because I guess that's what we're doing. A word about the background. I released a book in the middle of a pandemic today, this summer, called Angrynomics. I'm not going to talk about the book, but it's better than what my office usually looks like. So there's a free bit of advertising for the book, in case you're wondering what that is. I'm now going to share a screen and do a little bit of talking. So let's go with this. And so let's talk about this title. Josh approached me and said, would you like to do a talk? What might the title be? And I said, well, how about this as a title? Now, this is not an endorsement or Trump or even a prediction in this case, although I'm happy to talk about that later on. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that if you think that the big shock is Trump, that's only part of the story. The real story is the fact that Europe finds itself in a very different neighborhood from the one that it thought that it occupied. And historically, it has occupied since basically the introduction of the euro in 1999. The world has changed. Europe is trying to understand those changes and catch up. And it's a paradoxical world because the more its external environment becomes hostile, an example of that might be a second Trump term, the more it is poised to actually become more rather than less integrated. Now, this is a big change in my own thinking because back in 2013, I did a book called Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, that said that the whole austerity twist in Europe was going to end badly and cause a decade of lost growth. and that was sadly correct. At that point in time, I then did another book called The Future of the Euro that said the Europe will survive, but it's not going to be a happy marriage. I think I'm a bit more upbeat now, and it's mainly because necessity is the mother of invention. So that could be the subtitle of this, if you want to put it that way. So without further ado, let's go forward. This is a play in 3 acts. Act 1, I need to take you into the recent past. Self-inflicted wounds from 2009 to 2015. By 2012, when the big panic had started over public debts coming from the global financial crisis, Europe was not in great fiscal health. As you can see there, I've chucked Japan in the middle of that chart because they at the time were the warning to everyone about how much debt you could accumulate and how your economy would peter out and die because of it. And it looked like everyone else was heading north of 100%, and there was a great deal of concern about this at the time. So we had to cut the debt. But here's the interesting thing. We started cutting the debt as early as 2009 in some cases, particularly in the periphery countries, the ones that were under so-called Troika control, namely the adjustment programs in Ireland and in Spain and in Greece. But as you can see from this chart, what you really see is that debt's increasing rather than decreasing. Why would that be if you're cutting your debt? And we know they were cutting their debt because if you look at Greek public spending, you can see that it peaks in 2008 and never recovers. Yet at the same time, Greek debt to GDP is going up. Well, why is this? Well, something that we warned at the time is that if all of your trading partners basically simultaneously decide to cut debt, what that means is paying back public assets, shedding national savings, essentially running a surplus in the governmental sector, which means that correspondingly, by the logic of accounts, there has to be a deficit in the private sector, which means that there will be less spending. Corresponding to that, if you think of an economy whose GDP is the bottom of a sum, right? Let's say that's 100, and let's say your debt's 100 on the top. If you knock 20% off the bottom, you've just increased your debt to GDP by 20 percentage points without spending a penny. So what happened was these simultaneous contractions of these European economies in the name of austerity shrunk GDP. Public spending indeed went down, but overall debt went up. That created the problem that they were facing, which was a lost decade of growth. Pardon me. Now, why was it that we thought this way? Well, possibly because it turned out the government debt wasn't the problem at all. What was actually going on was, as usually happens, a private sector banking crisis morphing into a public sector debt problem. So how does this work? Well, one way to think about this is, I love this term, the greatest moral hazard trade in human history. So this is interest rate convergence in the euro area for a selection of countries. This is what they paid on 10-year debt going into the euro. So if you have a look at the red line at the top, you'll see Greece. Unfortunately, the vertical axis on this is cut off, but that's essentially 16% of interest you're paying. All the rest are floating around 10 to 9 to 7%. As you can see, back in the day, you were saying that the Greek debt was very risky. There's a reasonable chance that we're going to default. And in fact, Italy and everybody else who's in there were also quite risky. And then by 1999, all of that risk disappeared. Did these countries suddenly become much surer bets? Well, what was actually happening was basically large banks in Europe and elsewhere figured out that as the euro was coming in, essentially what was going to happen is everyone was going to borrow Germany's interest rate. So you got this convergence on the way down. Now, how do you make money on a declining spread, as they say in finance? Well, you have to basically up the volume of your transactions. So you end up building huge amounts of leverage into the system and the banking system, trying to chase profits as these interest rates converge down and down and down. And what we saw was the result was that core banks got stuffed with periphery debts gone bad as a result of over-lending. What you hear is foreign banks combine consolidated claims on the periphery. So what that means is that 33% of French GDP, or the equivalent, is basically hanging out in French banks in the form of debt from very impaired sovereigns called Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. The same for Germany, just around 22%, and even the UK is very much on the hook. Add all this together, the exposures come to about 3 trillion euros. So what you've done is basically created a huge levered banking crisis in European banks. One example of this was, or if you do the gross example on this, assets held by Germany, France, and the UK were about double the entire GDP of the EU. And if you add them all up, It's a much, much bigger problem. So you literally can't bail this. You have built a system that is too big to bail. Now, there we go. France was the exemplar of the too big to bail problem. There you can see French GDP, the top 3 bank assets and total bank assets. And of course, all of these countries are now in the euro. So this created a problem. If you have your own printing press, you can print your way out of trouble. Basically, you can devalue the currency externally. That is, you can default slowly on foreigners, or you can inflate your way out of trouble by basically bailing domestically. But if you're in the euro, you don't control your own printing press. So you've got a big problem because your GDP is 100, but your bank assets for your top 3 are nearly 250%. So if your banks are levered at 40 to 1, all you need is a 3% turn against their base capital, and your banking sector, which is twice the size of your economy or more, is now insolvent. And that's really what Europe was facing by 2012. So Draghi comes in 2012 and says, I will do whatever it takes within my mandate to save the euro and be sure that it's enough. And everyone goes, okay, because at the end of the day, you now had a central bank that acts, as they call it, a lender of last resort. And it basically pumped enough money in the system to make sure that the yields on those periphery bonds went back down to German levels and everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. But the problem was that no printing press in your own country means you can't bail your own banks. EU banks are dependent on the Fed for dollar funding. This is an incredibly important part. Part of the reason these banks got into so much trouble is they weren't borrowing in euros, they were borrowing in US dollars, which means they had a currency mismatch. And what that meant was when the United States went and had problems in 2008, 2009, paradoxically, as money flew into the United States, there was no way for banks, even in Britain that has its own printing press, to basically bail out its own bank. So it's doubly crippled. You basically have to rely on what were called Fed swap lines. You can't inflate or devalue, so that means fiscal transfer from the rich north to the south, to which the Germans, of course, said 9. And if you don't do that, the only way that you can try and resolve this is deflation and unemployment. But then you get to that problem, whereas you shrink the denominator, the numerator gets bigger. So the more that you cut in sequence at the same time, the more the economy shrinks and the worse off you get. And the result of this was really a lost decade. So if you have a look there you see Germany. Germany at the top begins to basically recover through industrial exports and exports of finished goods to other recovering economies, namely the United States and China. But then when you have a look at the other countries there, what you've got there is Italy, and you've got Greece at the bottom, and Spain, and you can see basically they are completely flat through that period. There has been no growth for 10 years. So imagine an economy in which there's been no growth, high unemployment, and basically a giant austerity put, whereby private sector debt on the balance sheet of banks became public sector debt, which was then attempted to be triaged through a series of cuts, which actually produced more unemployment and crushed growth. This was not a happy decade for Europe. But under the surface, people ain't stupid, even in European institutions, I'm pleased to report. First of all, the IMF comes out in 2013, very softly, but very strictly in 2015, and says that this whole turn to austerity is not just a bad idea, it can't work. There's a bit of debate with the European Commission, but by 2015, they come over to saying this very sotto voce, that in fact, this was a bad idea. The policy consequence of this was that the EU's growth model after 2010, which depends upon exports, essentially the North, think Holland and Germany, basically with their supply chain countries, Eastern Europe that produce the components for cars, sell BMWs to the United States and sell Mercedes to China. That's the basic growth model. The way that this works, though, in terms of a currency area, is if you're running an external surplus, you're basically growing through exports. There has to be a corresponding deficit somewhere. And in 2012, in a fit of, how could I put it, fiscal self-torture, the EU rewrote its rules on budget deficits, the so-called six-pack ruling, which essentially meant that you had to essentially run a primary budget surplus going forward, and you were allowed very, very little in the way of deficits. That, in the middle of austerity, was almost a suicide pact. And what happened was by 2015, the Commission started turning a blind eye to this, so that France and Spain and Italy essentially could take the fiscal restraints off a little bit. By doing so, growth in the Eurozone haltingly begins to return by 2015, 2016. And what happens in 2016? The unthinkable happens. So the EU is completely unprepared for anything approaching US non-cooperation. particularly through the financial crisis. The Americans under the Obama administration had been lecturing, correctly in my view, the Europeans that this German fetishism with austerity was simply holding back global and local recovery, and they needed to lighten up. The Fed swaps I mentioned earlier, what really essentially saved the European banking system and thus the European economy. And there was great cooperation between the two blocs by the time you get to 2015, 2016. But then in walks Trump, and basically cooperation is no longer the name of the day. Tariffs, etc., are going to come down the track. Obvious target is the EU massively underspends on defence. You can quibble about the fact that by hosting US bases, Germany actually spends more than it looks like, etc. But you can't quibble with the fact that German helicopters don't fly, 80% of their tanks are non-operable, and basically everyone's been massively free riding on NATO for at least 2 generations. Trump's going to politicize this. And again, go back to that Fed swaps argument. The EU is dependent on US dollar liquidity and export-led growth. Right, so Europeans love surpluses. We have to have a budget surplus. You have an export surplus. Well, everything sums to zero at a global level, and basically the only way you're able to run your export surplus is if someone else is running the corresponding deficit. Now, if they decide that they don't want to run that deficit anymore, or they want to put conditions on running that deficit through tariffs and other policy instruments, then who's the one that's holding the strong card? Is it the United States that runs the deficit, or Europe that runs the surplus? It's actually the United States. So the EU then becomes an open target for tariffs. What do we see domestically? Round one, well, a Republican perennial. You get in and you basically do tax cuts, all of which basically went to the top earners. Why were you doing this? Partly politics. I like to call this sticking it to blue state homeowners, because that's what they did with the mortgage tax reduction. The cuts went to the very top. This was, again, a massive inequality accelerator, but we've been doing that for 20 years, so that is not anything new. And the idea behind it was that this would be a fiscal bind on any future Democratic administration. Look, we've already spent it on tax cuts. We got a big boom. It went into the stock market. My constituents are happy. You guys have to pay for it. This is austerity in waiting. But then the tariff starts coming out, and this is very interesting. See, as well as being the world's biggest debtor, the United States has incredible power because as the world's largest market, it can play and gamble with what people in gambling circles call martingales. So a martingale basically is you just keep doubling the bet, and eventually when it comes back to you, no matter how much you've lost, if you're doubling all the time, you're going to win. The only way that you can do this is if you have unlimited liquidity. Why do you have unlimited liquidity? Because you have the US dollar that everybody else earns in international trade and has to bank as a liability in the domestic banking system, which they have to turn into an asset, which means buying treasuries, which essentially allows us to rinse and repeat the game as much as we possibly want. So we start off quite small, 34 million in tariffs, mainly on China. And then there's another 16 billion on tariffs. Oh, and then the big one, 200 billion, and then another 200 billion. And we're starting to go with the Europeans on 7.5 billion, and then another 250 billion temporarily halted. Then there's the rulings on Airbus, and then there's been a bunch of other tariffs on French wine, which I'm particularly upset about, etc., etc. But this is really just round one. And we're in all of round two in that sense. But what it shows us is that when you have unlimited liquidity, when everyone is dependent on the dollar, even the EU is, and their banking systems still are, in that case, then we can play martingales and you will eventually do whatever we want. Round three, upending the global order. So this is Huawei. This is the increasing concern over Chinese researchers in sensitive parts of the US economy, including the research sectors and universities. But there's a lot more being going on than this. NATO has effectively been sidelined. President Macron of France recently called it brain dead. But the United States has been very, very passive on Russia, except on one thing, gas imports. It wants Europe to basically liquefy its gas or build liquefied gas terminals and import it all the way from the US fracking sites rather than from Russia. Actively encouraged Brexit. If you think about this as foreign policy, rather than not taking a stance on it, or as the Obama administration said, they think it's actually a mistake, we have active encouragement of the British government to leave, thereby weakening the European Union. The WTO, far from being brain dead, is now functionally dead because the United States refuses to appoint appellate judges to the court, so it can't issue any rulings, so that one's now gone. And technological competition to the fore with China through being worried about Belt and Road investment and China 2025 plans has really brought out the idea of a new Cold War between China and the US, with the EU sitting very uncomfortably in the middle, right to the fore. Oh, and by the way, there's also been a complete turn against environmental investment in the US. My favorite example of that was the recent ruling that fund managers for 401k and related plans are not allowed to advise you into green investment strategies because they must maximize the return irrespective of your environmental preferences. So even at the micro level of your individual pensions, the Trump administration is basically saying you don't get to bet on the environment here. This is a bit of a problem, I'll explain why, because the rest of the world is about to bet big on decarbonization, and we're very much on the other side of that deal. What is all this compounded by? The rise of what tech people call the splinter net. You see this with the struggle in Europe over 5G. Europe initially allies with China because it wants to safeguard its export markets in China, particularly the Germans are vulnerable in this way. But then it fragments. The Brits back out, the French get worried, and the Germans don't know what to do. China's Great Wall and surveillance society versus the US digital giants. Where exactly is Europe in this? If you have a look around the world, you'll find there are no European digital platforms at scale. There's no Alipay, there's no WeChat, there's no WeWe, there's nothing that China's got, there's no Google. We may have Spotify, but that's not really a platform that you can do a lot with. And in terms of payment systems, basically they're already regionally fragmented. And again, the Europeans don't have one and are massively behind in digital payments. And then came COVID. I mean, really, could it get any better? So what was COVID? COVID was a supply and demand shock. If you have a look at that picture on the left, basically look at leisure and hospitality. Massive constriction of supply and also of demand. But you see this across almost every sector. Why? Because we sent everybody home for 3 months and shut everything down at the same time. What does this lead to? Well, in the context of that disrupted global order, it leads to the further fragmentation of supply chains, a further acceleration of deglobalization, more national security onshoring of production, a collapse of labor supply and spending, open and suppressed unemployment increasing in the Western countries, and a massive increase in public debts and deficits, all of which suggests that the austerity ghost will come back if we're not too careful. Act 3, China is no longer a reliable partner. These are pictures of the Uyghur internment camps that the BBC managed to smuggle out. A couple of interesting examples have been going on below the radar. If anybody's been to Trieste in the Adriatic, it's a beautiful old city that used to be known as the lungs of the empire for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It basically, everything came in there as the major port and then went out into the, from everywhere from Romania to Hungary to Austria. And this is the main trading port. Once the empire's gone and you have rump Austria, basically it goes into decline. On the other side of the continent, Duisburg, I'm pretty sure it's Duisburg, is one of the towns that's on the Kiel Canal. And the Kiel Canal has had so little investment from the Germans because German industrial and public sector investment basically has collapsed over the past 10 years because of this fetish of running balanced budgets. The locks on that canal are falling off. Both of these places became very easy targets for Chinese Belt and Road investment. And the reason that they're doing this is they figured out that if they can basically ship their stuff to Trieste and have a high-speed rail link that basically runs right across Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan into Europe, and then you can go around the north and you can run your ships down the Kiel Canal, you can effectively export all of the stuff that you want to Europe and never have to worry about the American Navy again. So they're already playing the long game, and hardly anyone's paying any attention to the strategic consequences of this in Europe. We began to see around 2018 hostile acquisitions of European technology firms. What little action there is in the digital and AI space was being hastily bought up by Chinese companies or Chinese-fronted companies, which resulted in Germany passing a law restricting this. We saw pressure on Germany from China over exports. Once the human rights consequences of Uyghur incarceration and other such things were coming to the fore, the European Union wrote a report criticizing China. The Chinese phoned up the Germans and said, that thing never shows the light of day, or your cars aren't getting sold anymore. By the way, you have, I think, 13 Volkswagen factories here. Perhaps it's an even higher number, I forget. And essentially the Germans folded, and that report never saw the light of day. We have huge dependency in Europe on China for green tech at scale. So essentially the United States has just given up on, just pretends that carbon isn't a problem and the decarbonization is a left-wing plot. The rest of the world doesn't do this. Europe basically has very ambitious green tech plans. But the way it works is essentially European firms invent it and license it to China. This is what's happened with windmills in large part. And then China does it at scale, proves and improves the technology, and then you share the license. That's the model that the EU was hoping to go with. The problem is now that China is less than a reliable partner, in part because it turns out they really are communists and they don't care about human rights at all, that relationship suddenly gets very complicated. So what they're hoping was, in the face of American intransigence and volatility, and basically upending the old apple cart on the transatlantic side, they could cope with China in some sense as a reliable partner and move forward on an agenda of green investment. It's not entirely clear that you can actually do this now. So the green transition ultimately in Europe is dependent upon China's cooperation. Xi Jinping's open commitment to get to carbon zero by 2060 tells us that they're still on the same train, but it's a question of whether Europe wants to travel along the same track. And if it does at a time when the United States and China are no longer getting on, that bespeaks even greater frictions between the two blocs. So how would a second Trump term strengthen the EU? Well, they've got no one else to rely on apart from other member states. I remember I was in Ireland once and I was asked about Scottish independence. And one of my interlocutors in Ireland says, you know, the great thing about being independent is there's no one to blame except yourself. And we're in a situation where the EU has been used by member states as something to blame. And the EU itself has always blamed other things for the things that's going on. That game is no longer possible. Let's say that if Trump gets back in, he will tariff strategic sectors such as airlines and tech and other areas. The response to this actually is to accelerate something that should have happened a long time ago. That is that Europe is still selling 20th century technologies in the 21st century world. The response is a new emphasis on strategic autonomy and industrial policy. Next, Trump will further undermine NATO. I think that is a given. And of course, that means EU's defense spending needs to get up, and some notion of common defense and actually deciding who is an ally and who's not will actually need to come back to Europe. China and US export markets, which are the main source of growth for the EU, are increasingly uncertain, which means that they need to build up EU-level demand with new investment, which is why the European Green New Deal is so important to them, apart from the fact that it's something that needs to be done. And Trump's environment policy versus Xi's carbon pledge essentially says, as I suggested, that you're going to side with Europe over the US. There needs to be greater EU and China green tech cooperation and AI investment, but if there is, the political problems with that vis-a-vis the US are absolutely massive. So has the EU been doing anything that would suggest that they're actually getting up to doing this? Well, there's the Next Gen Fund, which basically is, some say the Hamiltonian moment. Maybe it's more like Hamilton the musical, flashy and ultimately not that important. But just now it looks as if it's quite important. 750 billion of common debt funded for the first time for post-COVID investment. The pandemic emergency program from the ECB of 1350 billion euro. Basically, we will keep the markets stable. And in fact, if you do this and compare it to what the Fed has actually done so far, it scales up to be bigger than the Fed this time around. The F word is back. Fiscal policy was absent from European policy discussions, basically from 1999. And today we have helicopter money in the form of direct payments to households for furloughs. We have tax holidays for business. We have suspension of fiscal rules. We have the ECB buying corporate and other types of debt. Fiscal policy is back big time. There was some resistance to this, the so-called frugal countries of the North that didn't like the idea of the Next Gen Fund, but they ultimately gave up. And now there's new discussion, and I think this is very interesting, about re-advancing once again the international role of the euro. If you take the Next Gen Fund as a common debt issuance and you think of a world that's short safe assets in a world of negative yields, if you were to offer 20% of Eurozone GDP in a joint and several bond, which reflected the joint risk of all of these countries rather than just the ones that were country specific, and the ECB stood behind that, you would get every buyer on the planet to take it as an alternative to holding dollars, because holding dollars enables the United States to behave very badly with no cost. So if you think the United States is holding you hostage because of its ability to provide global liquidity, you doing something about that by advancing the global role of the euro would be very useful indeed. And the fact that that is now in policy discussions at the level of the ECB and also at the Commission says that they are at least seriously thinking about this. Now, will it work? Well, let's just say that they have every incentive. They are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And if you have a look at that last slide, you'll see the EU's biggest trade partners are China and Russia, both for exports and for imports. Your growth model comes from exports, and your components for doing so are coming from the same countries. You are strategically vulnerable. You need to build up domestic capacity. They need to worry about domestic demand rather than foreign demand, and the world has ultimately changed. Given that the world has changed, whether Trump is re-elected or not, the EU has to come together in a way it hasn't done before. Will it do so? I would put it this way. If Trump is re-elected, the odds are even stronger. And I will pause at that time and we can go to questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Blyth, for your fascinating remarks. So we are going to open it up for Q&A now, and I want to encourage all attendees with questions to submit these using the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. So we have a first set of questions, and a number of them relate, in fact, to the UK and to Brexit, to the role of the UK currently in relations to the European Union. So maybe you could say a few comments about that specifically, and then we'll shift to some questions that are asking about kind of the opposite of what you're describing. If Biden does in fact win, what impact might that have on some of the things you discussed? So let's maybe start with the questions about Brexit and the UK.
Oh, can I say something first? I knew I got the town wrong. Sorry about that, Andreas. It's not actually Kiel either. There's a specific town that apparently has been really targeted for Belt and Road investment, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. I should have checked that before I did that. Apologies for getting the town wrong. It's not Duisburg. It sounds like that. I'm sure it is. Anyway, please continue. You were saying, what were we doing? Brexit?
Yeah.
Right. Who cares? Brexit is a rounding error. It's got short-term costs, particularly in terms of the cost of, for example, German auto exports to one of the larger small markets. But ultimately, and yeah, we're all going to get hung up on fish, right? So basically, French fishermen are going to be banned from British waters, and then the Royal Navy will come out, and probably one or two people will be hurt, and then a deal will be done 6 months from now. It's all noise. I think the only way that it really matters is another, and this relates to the comment about IndyRef 2, basically Scottish independence. I think that what it shows is that the British government has increasingly decided on a course which is dysfunctional to basically, if you will, its basic growth model. I mean, the way that Britain grows is it's a giant financial entrepot that clears euros, and it sat at the top table of the EU vetoing anything it didn't like, and it decided it wanted a better deal than that. There was no better deal than that. And this has been dysfunctional for its politics and dysfunctional for its economics. If anything, when it happens, it will hurt Britain, and it will make IndyRef happen even faster in Scotland. So there's 2 for 1.
A related question is how will the UK be affected by either a Trump or a Biden win?
I don't think there's that much difference, believe it or not. Biden has to struggle with the same dynamics that could still bring Trump to power. It's not as if Biden goes in and we wait as if it's some kind of soap opera from the 1980s and we go, oh my God, it was all a dream. It was, thank goodness that 4-year nightmare's over. And the very real forces of structural inequality, structural racism, of highly polarized polity are still there. And Biden's going to have his work cut out basically trying to get anything through the Senate and trying to do anything at all with an extremely hostile Republican Party. So at that point in time, the notion that he's going to spend a great deal of time repairing transatlantic relations is the type of thing that foreign policy experts write about because no one gives them a reality check. I don't think that's on his top 10 list of things to do whatsoever. He may not tariff, right? There may be a break on that side. But in terms of the United States at this point, in a sense, deeply engaging with Europe, the only way that would happen is if the United States reversed itself very much on its environmental policy, became a net green investor, joined with Europe in that, and tried to freeze out China in the process. And that's a huge foreign policy turnaround that I just don't see Biden having the capacity to make.
Let me extend that question. There's a similar question that looks at a number of bilateral relationships and specifically points out that, so currently the forecasts do point to a Biden win. And so the attendees asking, how would that affect Brexit, so the UK-EU relation, but also how does it affect the US-China relationship as well as the US-EU relationship?
Well, I wouldn't do anything for Brexit. I mean, the only thing that Biden cares about is the Irish vote domestically, and that basically means don't screw the Good Friday Agreement, which the British government have already made plain that they will do. So when the Johnson administration has this phrase of levelling up the country, and it seems like a reasonable thing to do because, you know, all of the growth is in London and the rest of the country exists on transfers, including Scotland. So having growth in the rest of the country might be a good thing. However, that imagination pretty much stops at Leeds. Maybe it gets as far north as Newcastle. It certainly doesn't involve Scotland. And they have shown that they're quite willing to play fast and loose with international agreements and with treaties. So I wouldn't put a great deal of stock in anything that the Biden administration could do. They would only get involved if it basically threatened Irish sovereignty and the Irish sort of, you know, democratic voting bloc in the US. That's when they would care. In terms of how would it affect China relationships, I think a lot of this conflict is baked in, not because of some kind of Thucydides trap, rising power, always fights another. I think that's massively overstated. But because it turns out that China's communist. I mean, we kind of forgot this, right? It was this idea that like, well, they're run by the Communist Party, but they're not really communist. No, they really are. They really totally are, right? And you now have, you know, the cult of the leader. You have somebody who's going to be in power for life. You have a completely planned, technologically observed society, the like of which you just couldn't imagine in a Western country. And that's going to continue. It's going to be very hard for an American president of any stripe to embrace this. Plus, the fact is they really are out to steal your tech and your intellectual property rights because that's how you get rich. So, yeah, I mean, will it be as vulgar and will it be based on tariffs? No, but will the conflicts be there? Absolutely.
Thank you. Shifting a little bit, you referred earlier to technology, and one question asks, given that China and the US fight for dominance in critical technological areas, how will the Eurozone defend its place at the table?
Well, that's exactly the $64,000 question. For the longest time, they didn't think they had to. For the longest time, they thought they could basically just sit in the middle and benefit from both relationships. But when those relationships turn sour, and structurally so, they need to find a new way to deal with this. And the French are always the most interesting on this. The French used to bang on forever about giving the EU fiscal capacity. They used to talk about economic government, gouvernement économique. And now they started to talk about a new thing, strategic autonomy. And what does that mean? It means industrial policy. It means national champions. It means subsidizing investment. It means basically going very, very long on cheap funding in critical areas that they're weak, such as AI and other areas. And they really want to do this. Now, the limit factor on this is always the Germans, because the Germans have a successful business model. It's called sell diesel engines to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, that gig is up as well, because even in Europe, by 2035, you won't be allowed to drive diesel engines. So they're finally realizing that they need to change their business model as well, and they can't just rely on exports to the rest of the world. They've got to have endogenous sources of growth and demand. So they've got a lot to do, but part of that is finding kind of, you will, your own endogenous sources of growth, your own endogenous technology companies, and allowing them to grow and flourish so that you actually can compete against the big players on the Chinese side and on the US side.
Another participant refers to sort of the outlier countries in Europe, Poland and Hungary in particular, and how can the European Union be strengthened?
By basically disciplining people who don't want to be in the club. And the Hungarians basically have taken what's called the acquis communautaire, all of the laws you're meant to agree to, and went, no, 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 maybe, no, no, no. Poland's not far behind. They're allowed to do this, and they're not thrown out of what's called the European People's Party grouping in the European Parliament. Again, because the Germans are afraid of upsetting the apple cart. Why? Because Germany didn't globalize its supply chain for exports. It sent it to Eastern Europe, into places like Hungary, into places like Poland, and they are heavily integrated into the German growth model. Well, the problem for them is the same as the problem for Germany. That growth model needs to change. Nobody's going to buy diesel engines anymore. And ultimately, all the people who are employed digging coal in Poland face the same problem as people digging coal in West Virginia. We're now at a point where renewables are basically cheaper than coal, so give it up. So their long-term strategy can't be more of the same. It can't be to scuttle the EU going forward. And once that becomes more and more apparent, Hungary and Poland have a very serious set of choices to make. Either they want to play the same game as everyone else in the EU, or alternatively, they want to get out. And that may be something that may come along in the next 5 or so years. We'll see.
Professor Blyth, one of our attendees asks a question that I have a feeling you will have an opinion on. And they are asking if Indy Ref 2, and so they're referring to the proposed second Scottish independence referendum, is that going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I referenced this already as regards Brexit. I can see the questions too. And yes, it will happen, but the question is when. So I think there's a deal to be done. If the latest Ipsos Mori opinion polls in Scotland, when you look at it by generation, are astonishing. I've got the numbers on my phone. Let me look at this and I'll just tell you, this is incredible. I want to get these numbers right. Someone tweeted this out. There is it. Right, here. Okay, so here we go. Latest support for Scottish independence by age. 16 to 24, 79%. 24 to 30, 25 to 34, 68%. 35 to 44, absolutely crucial group in terms of asset holding, 70%. It only drops below 40 when you're above 65%. So you have to ask yourself, is this a kind of a life cycle effect, right? You like independence when you're young, you'll get assets, and then you don't like independence when you're old. Or is it a cohort effect? These people are different, right? My hunch is that they're different. And while the Johnson administration can say, no, no, you had your in-a-draft, you're not having another. I think basically the way that they are mishandling Brexit, because there's no good way of handling Brexit, is ultimately going to force them to play a very different set of cards, which is the following. And this is the deal to be done. Scotland essentially gets about 10% per capita, 1,200 quid a year in spending, more spending than the rest of the UK. That adds up. And Scotland basically wants to be independent, which means it will no longer have that subsidy, and that's going to hurt. So the British government wants to level up the country. Well, it could probably do with taking that money that it gives to the Scots and gives it to the North. And in which case then there could be a deal that Scotland could do over the extension of the maturities or the payment period on its share of the national debt that it inherits when it goes. The point is, when 60–70% of your people under 40 years old want out, you can say no this time, but you can't say no indefinitely. And I think those numbers are going to stay. And I think there is room to do a deal, because a post-Brexit Britain really isn't Britain. It's English nationalism. And if you recognise that for what it is, then you can have Scots nationalism, English nationalism, and then we'll still all get along. But it's more functional that way. If you're in a bad marriage, leave. Sticking around just pisses everyone off.
Thanks, Professor Blyth. We have on this call, on this Zoom, mostly Brown alumni as well as Brown parents. So parents who have children studying at Brown, some of whom are in Providence right now. Would you comment on your experience right now, living in Providence and teaching? Are you teaching all of your courses online? Are you teaching in person? What do you see in terms of academic and student life right now at Brown?
Well, being a 50-year-old guy, I don't see a lot of student life, so I can't really comment on that one. I am actually teaching face-to-face. This semester, I'm running my center, I'm doing some projects, and I'm doing graduate classes. So I'm meeting with graduate students face-to-face. We're doing what's called hybrid. The idea was that I'd have 2 or 3 people in the class, and then I'd have a dozen online. I've actually got a dozen people in the class and 2 or 3 online. It's a normal class, except I'm wearing a mask, which is very strange for the first 40 minutes, and then you actually forget about it and you just get on with it. So it's surprisingly normal. The other thing is Rhode Island is a very special place to live. It's even though it has a reputation as being this curious little mafia state that's mismanaged and all the rest of it, I have to say that it's actually reasonably well governed. And I'll give you an example of this. When the first wave of the pandemic was going on and Rhode Island was under quarantine and all this sort of stuff, we have a governor called Gina Raimondo, and I don't really knew that much about Gina. But her briefings, in contrast to both Trump and Boris, were amazing. It was wonderful to put them together. Because basically, you come out and you get denial and dogmatism and nonsense, and Boris just shaking his head and quoting Latin for no apparent reason. And Gina would come out and say, "So I bet everybody's wondering why care homes are so deadly. Let me explain this to you. We looked into it, and it's because everyone shares a bathroom." And you're like, "Oh my God, that makes perfect sense, right? That's why that is." So here's what we're going to do. So essentially, being calm, imparting information, generating trust, following through on what you're doing. That's what we do. And in a small state like Rhode Island, I mean, our daily infection rate on the east side of Providence, not daily, but our infection rate on the east side of Providence is around 1.2%. And we've managed to keep it that way for about 2 months now. The infection rate at Brown is below 1%. I mean, there are schools blowing up all over the country. It's not Brown, definitely not. We are doing this really well. I get tested twice a week. I'm kind of like the canary in the coal mine for the rest of my family, because if I've got it, I probably got it from them, not from Brown, right? Next semester, I'm also teaching, as they call it, hybrid. I will be in a room with whoever happens to be around, and if people feel more comfortable online, then they can be online. But it's not ideal. But it's past the unprecedented now. I think we're actually figuring out how to do this, and I think we can see some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. And this too will pass, and we'll look back on it in a few years and go, "God, you remember the crazy COVID times? That was nuts." But you know what, at Brown, it's not really that nuts. It's actually just when you've got people who know what they're doing and they follow through on what they're doing, and this is true at the university level. The provost and the president have been excellent on this as well, just clear, consistent messages and clear, consistent policies that people follow. That's all you need. And it works. So, I'm really happy to, people say, "What's it like at Brown?" I'm happy to be at Brown. I'm actually really happy to be at Brown in this moment, because it's a place that knows what the hell it's doing, and that's good.
I will second everything you just said, and also mention to our attendees around the world that Brown has launched a very extensive testing program, and we publish all of the results daily in a COVID tracker. And in a few moments, I will put a link to this tracker in the chat box. I haven't checked today, but when I checked yesterday, there had been one case on campus in the past week, which is really astonishing when you think of what's happening in other cities around the country, and specifically other universities, not only around the world, around the country, but in Rhode Island. There's a university down the road that had, I think, 270 cases,
right,
last week. So Brown really is doing a terrific job.
Oh, great. There's two. Connor's got a question up, and then Andreas has got a question up as well. So let's get into those. Yeah. Andreas, actually, I worked with Andreas when he did his MBA at Brown. So hello, hi Andreas, nice to see you again. Do you want to read this one, Josh? Andreas's last one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. All right, so we had a discussion on the Green Deal in my KPR, that was K Reflection Project and the MBA in 2017. And you said this is the biggest difference with Europe betting on the Green Deal in the US is not. Is this an asset for Europe to bank or not? I have to say I think it is. I think the United States is making a strategic error of historical proportions here. Because at the end of the day, climate doesn't care what you think. It's not a question of politics, it's a question of physics. Right? It's like arguing with molecules. This makes no sense whatsoever. And you either try and find technologies which you can sell to the rest of the world to adapt to this new situation, or you go into rank denialism. Rank denialism is a massively losing strategy. So it's just a question of how much are you willing to pay Europe and China for the tech you're going to need 10 years from now, once you figure out that basically that extra 10 years of denial was a really bad idea. So that's where I am with this. Connor's got one up here, says, as Merkel starts 6-month control of the EU, at what point, if at all, will she have to stand up against China regarding 5G and Huawei? will she be pushed more over time to the rest of the EU? As ever, this is the Germans are always the most important constituency, even when they don't want to be. And Merkel started her 6-month control of the EU at a time when she's looking for 6 months to get out of the door of German politics. So it's very much in flux as to what happens. A lot of it rests on German domestic politics. The attempt to put the SPD on a firmer footing with the current finance minister in the lead seems to have completely fallen flat. Essentially, whatever German public preferences are, they're not the same ones as the SPD at this point. The party which has surged the most is the Greens, which is very interesting. And I could see a Green CSU, Green CDU coalition of the type that you've got in Austria coming out of that. And if you do, then basically you're going to see intense, a focus on green investment, and that bespeaks cooperation with China. Does that then spill over into accepting the Huawei technology? Well, I'm no expert in this area, and I have no idea whether these things really contain backdoors or whether this is Western propaganda or whatever. But another thing that Europe wants to do, if it wants strategic independence, if it wants a strategic autonomy, is to build up companies like Ericsson so that they can supply their own 5G kit. So I don't think it's orthogonal. I think you can cooperate in some areas and then back out in others. And I think that basically Europe is going to back away from Huawei, not just because of American pressure, although it will help that if you had a Biden administration and then you backed out, it would make you look good, but because you want to build up your own domestic capacity for 5G kit. You can't be a leading sector of the global economy if you don't make your own stuff in the technologies that matter. And that's what's going to drive it more than anything else.
So, Professor Blyth, we have just a few minutes left for this webinar, and if unless other questions pop up in the next few seconds, would you perhaps share a few words about your book, which, as you point out, is in your background right behind you?
There it is. It feeds into the book.
And then, in addition to that, would you say a few words about the center that you direct, the William Rhodes Center for International Finance and Economics?
Sure. All right. So on the book is about why the world's so damn angry and what to do about it. And basically, it's angry because large-scale macroeconomic and financial crashes tend to produce outpourings of public anger, which lead to a realignment of politics, which leads sometimes to the rise of the radical right, who basically use this as a strategy in politics. That's the short answer. The micro side of this is that we've done a whole series of changes in labor and product markets across the developed world over the past 30 years, which has resulted in a shifting of risk from corporates and from states towards individuals without giving them the compensatory tools to actually embrace that risk in a positive way. Hence, we see deaths of despair, obesity, self-medication through alcohol, mental illness, etc., alongside the increasingly stressful and low-paid work that we see as common in our societies, despite these societies never being richer. So if you put that all together, people have every right to be angry. And the question is what to do about it, and that's what we talk about in the second half of the book. My co-author, Eric Lonergan, is a hedge fund manager that lives in London. The nice thing about being a hedge fund manager, or rather writing with one, is it's the only time that a professor looks good in comparison when you're hanging out with somebody who's a hedgie. So there we go. But that's the book. In terms of the center, the Rhodes Center for International Economics, how come a political scientist ended up running it? And why have I got an econ title? Because that's actually my formal title. I've spent my career looking at economics not as a thing to understand the world, although it is that, but as a thing in the world that is causally important. That how you define prosperity matters. How you talk about markets and what you think these things are matters politically. That how you define efficiency and what is efficient and what is not. Who gets to say what the proper level of unemployment is or is not. These are incredibly powerful political tools with massive distributional consequences. What I've tried to do at the Rhodes Center is to broaden out those types of themes of international economics and finance, such that we're having, and this is what Brown is best at, a truly interdisciplinary conversation around these points. So a couple of examples of things that we've got going on just now. Tomorrow we're going into another session. These would have been in person, but of course now they're actually online, and it kind of works really well. Is you take a conference that has 4 panels over one day and you do it over 4 days and you get 2 hours each. And we're 2/3 of the way through this conference on early American money. Basically, how did the Americans organize their monetary system prior to the revolution, during the revolution, and afterwards, and then its relevance for debates today, which are incredible. It's amazing. Did you know that the Americans actually used to earn their tax dollars and then burn them? The government would burn them and then issue new ones that you had to earn. This is how you paid your taxes, right? Lots of relevance for things like MMT, modern monetary theory, and all the rest of it. All that's everything we think is new, we've seen before. Next week we have another such workshop coming up on the notion of democracy in central banks. Central bank independence has been, if you will, one of the touchstones of governance of the past 30 years, but independent from whom? Well, independent from politics. Okay, and maybe that made sense 30 years ago in the context of an inflationary crisis. But right now, when central banks haven't hit their inflation targets in over a decade, there seems to be no inflation anywhere, no matter how hard we try to promote it. Demography is against us. Distribution is against us. Why do we still have these institutions? And is this notion of independence itself just a form of politics, or be one that's disguised? So we've got a bunch of very, very interesting people, from historians, sociologists, central bankers, economists, coming in to talk about these issues. And that generally is the type of thing that we do. This is trying to encourage an interdisciplinary conversation, because more eyes and more models are better than fewer eyes and fewer models on these questions, which are the ones that, you know, animate me, animate my research, and have kept me in the game for 30 years.
Thank you so much. Parting question, which we had to ask you today. What is your prediction for the upcoming election happening in 2.5 weeks here in the US?
And can I share my slides? Yes, Herman, I would be delighted to send you my slides, no problem. I'll give them to Josh. Anybody who wants the slides can get them from Josh. The prediction. So it's very difficult this time around. The reason I got it last time is because all you needed to do was listen to the Democrats talking to themselves, and you realize that they only talk to themselves. And it was a very elite swathe of society that basically talked to itself. The Clinton campaign was divorced from any type of organic connection to what was going on in the country. It was an accident waiting to happen, and therefore it happened. Trump walked into a constituency that was waiting there to be picked up. That's not the case this time. But you do have 40% of the country that will still walk across broken glass for this guy, because he has done one thing for them that Democrats have never done, which is to recognize the fact that they are the ones, whether they are or not, I'm saying subjectively, they're the ones that have lost out over the past 30 years. And the Democrats are still telling them that basically it's their fault and that they're privileged and so on and so forth. And it drives them completely mad. So it comes down to two things. Turnout. Basically, are you going to get Democrats to turn out their people? Are you going to get Republicans to turn out basically Trump supporters? And is it going to happen in those states where the margins are incredibly fine? Because that's what's going to determine the Electoral College. So this is an entirely different type of race. You would think that all of the missteps and confusion and vitriol and everything that's happened in the past 4 years with Trump, the covert and then finally overt racism, everything, that you know, this would be a breaking point. But the fact that he still hits 40% tells me that this has still got some way to run. And you know, there may be a land. One way to think about this: look at the popular vote. If you look at a map of the popular vote in the last election, what you find is that there's a giant blue peak around New York, literally on a map, right? And it peters out all the way across the country. There's a little bit around Houston. There's a big bit in Miami, and then LA and a bit of Portland, right? That's the popular vote. That's the majority of the popular vote. The rest of the country is nothing, right? That's not good when you're doing electoral college math. And I don't think that that vote is in yet. Now, so what would I call it? I would call it Biden, but I would call it Biden heavily contested. I don't think Trump's going to give it up. I think that this one's going to end up in the Supreme Court. And we're not going to know who's going to finally win this for a good couple of weeks after the election. So that's my call.
Thank you again, Professor Blyth, for speaking with our international alumni, parents, and friends today. We really appreciate your time and all of the terrific work that you are doing at Brown. And I want to wish everyone a pleasant and safe autumn. Be well, stay safe, and ever true to Brown.